Marcus Langley was a man who seemed to have it all. Born into modest beginnings, he worked tirelessly to climb the ladder of success and eventually became one of the wealthiest self-made businessmen in his city. Real estate deals and tech investments had turned him into a millionaire by the time he hit his mid-30s. With money came freedom, and Marcus loved nothing more than traveling the world in search of new adventures. From exotic beaches to ancient ruins, his passport was filled with stamps from nearly every corner of the globe. But there was something about Marcus that set him apart from other travelers: his need to stand out. He wasn't content simply admiring landmarks or soaking in local culture. He wanted to leave his mark wherever he went. Whether it was taking outrageous selfies at sacred sites or pulling stunts just for laughs, Marcus thrived on attention. To him, life felt like a never-ending party where rules were meant to be bent, or even broken, if it made things more exciting. One crisp autumn morning, Marcus found himself standing outside Buckingham Palace in London. The palace exuded grandeur, its golden gates gleaming under the soft sunlight. Tourists milled around, snapping photos and marveling at the iconic structure. Marcus joined them, but quickly grew bored. Sure, the palace was impressive, but it wasn't enough to hold his interest for long. Then he noticed the royal guards stationed nearby. Their bright red uniforms, tall bearskin hats, and stoic expressions drew curious glances from visitors. As Marcus watched, an idea began forming in his mind. Social media trends often featured people doing bold, outrageous things to grab attention, and Marcus fancied himself as someone who could pull off such stunts effortlessly. What if he did something unexpected here? Something no one would forget. His eyes landed on a small can of paint tucked inside his designer jacket, a leftover prop from a prank he'd done weeks earlier. A grin spread across his face as he imagined the reaction he'd get if he used it now. The thought excited him. Here he was, surrounded by history and tradition, yet completely untouchable because of his wealth and privilege. Or so he believed. Without pausing to consider the consequences, Marcus stepped closer to one of the guards. The guard stood perfectly still, embodying discipline and duty. Marcus told himself this would be harmless fun, a way to make people laugh, and maybe earn him some viral fame online. His heart raced as adrenaline coursed through his veins. This was going to be epic, he thought. Little did he know, however, that what seemed like a fleeting moment of amusement would spiral into a nightmare he couldn't escape. For all his confidence and charm, Marcus failed to see the weight of what he was about to do. In his quest for entertainment, he underestimated the power of respect and how easily it could be shattered. With a mischievous glint in his eye, Marcus stepped closer to the royal guard. The guard stood perfectly still, as though carved from stone, his expression unreadable behind the thick bearskin hat. Tourists around them whispered and pointed, their cameras clicking away as they captured memories of the historic palace. But Marcus wasn't interested in ordinary photos. He wanted something extraordinary, something that would make him unforgettable. Without hesitation, Marcus pulled out the small can of bright blue paint hidden in his jacket. With a flick of his wrist, he poured the liquid over the guard's immaculate red uniform. The vibrant color streaked down the fabric, dripping onto the polished boots below. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The murmurs of the crowd stopped. The clicking of cameras paused, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Then chaos erupted. Gasps filled the air as onlookers realized what had just happened. Some people laughed nervously, unsure if this was part of an act or some bizarre performance art. Others looked horrified, shaking their heads at the sheer audacity of the act. Marcus, however, basked in the attention. He threw his head back and laughed, clearly pleased with himself. "Come on," he said loudly, addressing the stunned crowd. "It's just a joke. Lighten up." But the guard didn't move. Not a muscle twitched, not an eyebrow raised. It was as if Marcus didn't exist. That unnerved him more than anything else. In his mind, the guard should have reacted, maybe shouted, maybe stepped back, or at least shown some sign of emotion. Instead, the man remained as stoic as ever, standing tall despite the sticky mess now ruining his uniform. For the first time since pouring the paint, doubt crept into Marcus's mind. Was this really such a good idea? He glanced around at the sea of faces surrounding him. Many were glaring at him now, their earlier amusement replaced by disapproval. Parents ushered their children away, muttering about how disrespectful he was being. A few tourists even began recording videos, not to share his funny stunt, but to document the fallout. Before Marcus could process what was happening, a group of armed police officers appeared, moving swiftly toward him. Their presence sent a jolt of panic through his body. This wasn't supposed to happen. It was just a prank. A silly, harmless prank. Surely they wouldn't arrest him for something so minor. As one officer gripped his arm firmly, another read him his rights. Marcus tried to protest, insisting it was all in good fun, but his words fell on deaf ears. The crowd parted as he was led away, his laughter fading into silence. Cameras flashed relentlessly, capturing every humiliating step. By the time he reached the police van, Marcus's bravado had crumbled. His face burned with shame as he realized the magnitude of what he'd done. What had felt like a thrilling moment of rebellion mere minutes ago now felt reckless and foolish. As the van doors slammed shut, Marcus caught sight of the painted guard one last time through the window. Still standing tall, still unmoving, the guard seemed almost symbolic, representing everything Marcus had failed to respect. Tradition, discipline, honor, all reduced to a cheap spectacle because of his selfish need for attention. And as the van sped away, Marcus couldn't shake the sinking feeling that this was only the beginning of his troubles. The ride to the police station felt endless. Marcus sat slumped in the back seat of the van, his designer jacket stained with sweat and regret. The weight of what he'd done pressed down on him like a heavy blanket. He replayed the scene at Buckingham Palace over and over in his mind. The bright blue paint dripping down the guard's uniform, the shocked faces of the tourists, the cold stares of disapproval. For the first time in years, Marcus felt powerless. When they arrived at the station, officers led him inside without a word. The sterile environment, fluorescent lights, metal chairs, and gray walls, only added to his growing unease. They took his fingerprints, snapped a mugshot, and confiscated his belongings before locking him in a small holding cell. It was a far cry from the luxurious penthouses and private jets Marcus was used to. As he sat there alone, staring at the peeling paint on the walls, reality began sinking in deeper than ever before. Hours later, an officer entered the room to inform him of the charges: public disorder, vandalism, and disrespecting the monarchy. Each accusation hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. He tried to explain himself, insisting it had been just a joke, but the officer cut him off sharply. "You don't get to decide what's funny when it comes to respecting national symbols," the man said sternly. Those words lingered in Marcus's mind long after the officer left the room. By evening, news outlets had already picked up the story. Photos of Marcus pouring paint on the royal guard were splashed across headlines worldwide. Social media exploded with reactions, some mocking him, others calling for harsh punishment. His name trended online, not as a successful businessman, but as the reckless tourist who humiliated tradition. Friends and acquaintances began distancing themselves almost immediately. Calls went unanswered, messages unread. Even his business partners issued statements condemning his actions, fearing association with his tarnished reputation. The next morning, Marcus appeared in court for his initial hearing. Dressed in wrinkled clothes and looking visibly shaken, he barely resembled the confident millionaire everyone knew. Reporters crowded outside the courthouse, shouting questions as he walked in. Cameras flashed relentlessly, capturing every step of his public humiliation. Inside, the judge listened impassively as prosecutors outlined the case against him. Marcus's lawyer argued that it was a momentary lapse in judgment, but the evidence spoke louder than any defense. Back in his cell, Marcus scrolled through news articles on a borrowed phone, horrified by how quickly his life had unraveled. Headlines branded him as arrogant and disrespectful. Comment sections overflowed with vitriol, labeling him everything from clueless to narcissistic. Worst of all, his family had seen it too. His wife called him that night, her voice trembling with anger and disappointment. "How could you do something so stupid?" she asked, tears audible in her tone. Their conversation ended abruptly when she told him she needed space, and possibly more than that. As days turned into weeks, Marcus realized just how isolated he had become. Once surrounded by admirers and sycophants, he now found himself utterly alone. No amount of money or influence could shield him from the consequences of his actions. For the first time in his life, Marcus faced the true cost of his arrogance. What started as a fleeting attempt to entertain himself had spiraled into a nightmare, stripping away his freedom, dignity, and relationships. And deep down, he knew this was only the beginning. The public backlash against Marcus was swift, merciless, and unrelenting. Within hours of the incident, social media platforms were flooded with posts dissecting his actions. Memes mocking him spread like wildfire, turning his face into a symbol of arrogance and disrespect. Hashtags like #PaintPrank and #RoyalRespect trended globally, with millions weighing in on the controversy. At first, some commenters found humor in the audacity of the act, joking about how creative or bold it was. But as more details emerged about the sacred role of the royal guards and the gravity of Marcus's offense, the tone shifted dramatically. People began sharing stories about the history and significance of the royal guards, highlighting their centuries-old traditions and unwavering dedication to duty. Many pointed out that these men weren't just standing there for show. They represented an institution deeply rooted in national pride and cultural heritage. To deface their uniform wasn't just a prank. It was an insult to an entire nation's values. This newfound perspective turned the tide against Marcus. What had initially seemed like harmless fun quickly morphed into outrage, with users calling him entitled, selfish, and disrespectful. As the online fury grew, so did the real-world consequences. Major brands and business partners who once eagerly associated with Marcus began severing ties. Sponsorships were canceled, contracts terminated, and deals put on hold. His company, which relied heavily on partnerships and public perception, started crumbling under the weight of his tarnished reputation. Employees whispered nervously about layoffs while clients demanded refunds or pulled out of negotiations altogether. The empire Marcus had spent years building was collapsing faster than he ever thought possible. But perhaps the most painful fallout came from his personal life. His wife, Claire, couldn't bear the shame anymore. She had always been proud of her husband's success, but now struggled to reconcile that image with the man splashed across tabloids worldwide. After days of silence, she finally confronted him during one of their rare visits at the station. Her voice trembled as she told him she was filing for separation. "I can't keep living like this," she said, tears streaming down her face. "You've embarrassed our family, Marcus. I don't even recognize you anymore." Their teenage daughter, Emily, refused to speak to him entirely. When Marcus called home, hoping to explain himself, she hung up the phone without saying a word. Her silence hurt more than anything else. Marcus knew he had let her down, not just as a father, but as someone she looked up to. Every ignored text and unanswered call felt like another nail in the coffin of his broken relationships. Even his closest friends distanced themselves, unwilling to be dragged into the scandal. Some sent polite messages expressing regret, while others ghosted him completely. Invitations to dinners and events dried up overnight. The loneliness gnawed at him, making each day feel heavier than the last. For the first time in his life, Marcus understood what it meant to truly lose everything. Not just material wealth, but trust, love, and respect. Sitting alone in his cell, Marcus scrolled through endless streams of criticism online. Each angry comment, each hateful meme, felt like a punch to the gut. He tried to tell himself it didn't matter, that people would forget eventually. But deep down, he knew better. This wasn't something that would blow over easily. The world had judged him, and its verdict was clear. Marcus Langley wasn't just a foolish tourist. He was a cautionary tale. and for the first time, he wondered if he deserved it. The courtroom was packed on the day of Marcus's sentencing. Reporters jostled for space, their cameras flashing like strobe lights as he entered, flanked by his lawyers. Marcus looked pale and exhausted, his once confident demeanor replaced by a haunted expression. He had spent weeks preparing for this moment, hoping that his legal team could negotiate a lighter punishment. But deep down, he knew there was no escaping accountability for what he had done. The prosecution painted a damning picture during the trial. They presented surveillance footage showing Marcus pouring paint over the guard, alongside witness testimonies from tourists who described the scene in vivid detail. One elderly woman recounted how she had gasped in disbelief, clutching her chest as if she'd witnessed an act of sacrilege. Another witness, a history teacher visiting London with her students, tearfully explained how the incident ruined what should have been an educational and inspiring trip. The judge listened intently, his face stern and unyielding. When it came time for Marcus to speak, his voice trembled as he read a prepared statement. "I never intended to cause harm," he began, his eyes scanning the room nervously. "It was meant to be a harmless joke, a stupid, thoughtless mistake. I deeply regret my actions and take full responsibility for them." His apology sounded sincere, but the damage was already done. No amount of words could undo the humiliation he had caused or erase the disrespect shown to such a revered institution. After hours of deliberation, the verdict came. 6 months in jail, a hefty fine, and a 10-year ban from entering the United Kingdom. The sentence hit Marcus like a freight train. Jail. A ban. These weren't just punishments. They were life-altering consequences. As the gavel struck, sealing his fate, Marcus felt the walls close in around him. For all his wealth and privilege, he was now powerless to change what lay ahead. Life behind bars was nothing like the world Marcus had known. Gone were the plush suites, fine dining, and tailored suits. Instead, he found himself in a cramped cell with concrete walls and a thin mattress that barely cushioned the hard bed frame. His cellmate, a burly man named Derek, didn't hide his disdain for Marcus's entitled attitude. "You think you're better than us," Derek spat one evening after hearing about the paint stunt. "Newsflash, rich boy, nobody cares about your money here." Days blurred into weeks as Marcus struggled to adapt. Meals consisted of bland food served on plastic trays, and showers were timed to the minute. The lack of privacy grated on him, and the constant noise, from shouting matches to late-night arguments, made sleep nearly impossible. Worst of all was the isolation. Other inmates avoided him, not because they feared him, but because they resented him. To them, Marcus wasn't just another prisoner. He was a symbol of everything they despised: privilege, arrogance, and recklessness. To survive, Marcus had to swallow his pride. He learned to clean floors, scrub toilets, and follow orders without complaint. Every task was humiliating, but each also taught him something valuable: humility. Slowly, he began to see the error of his ways, not just the paint incident, but the years of selfish behavior that led up to it. Conversations with fellow inmates opened his eyes to perspectives far removed from his own. Many had made mistakes too, some far worse than his, yet they carried themselves with a resilience Marcus admired. One inmate, an older man named Greg, became a reluctant mentor. Greg had served several years for fraud and understood the weight of poor decisions. During quiet moments in the yard, he shared stories about rebuilding trust and finding purpose after failure. "You can't change the past," Greg told Marcus one afternoon. "But you can decide what kind of person you want to be moving forward. That's the only thing you control." By the time Marcus completed his sentence, he was a changed man, or at least he hoped so. Walking out of prison on a chilly morning, he squinted against the sunlight, feeling both free and burdened. Free from confinement, yes, but burdened by the knowledge that redemption wouldn't come easily. The road ahead would require more than apologies. It would demand action. And for the first time, Marcus was ready to try. When Marcus stepped out of prison, the world felt unfamiliar. The air smelled different, sharper, colder, and the streets seemed louder, more chaotic. He had spent months locked away, reflecting on his mistakes, but now he faced the daunting task of rebuilding a life that lay in ruins. His designer clothes were gone, replaced by a plain jacket and worn-out shoes provided by the prison. For the first time in years, Marcus didn't feel like the wealthy, powerful man he once was. Instead, he felt small, vulnerable, and uncertain about where to begin. His first stop was a modest apartment he had rented using the little money he had left. It was a far cry from the sprawling penthouse he used to call home. Just one bedroom, peeling wallpaper, and a leaky faucet. But it was enough for him. Sitting on the edge of the creaky bed, Marcus stared at the empty walls and wondered how he could ever piece together the fragments of his shattered existence. The weight of his past decisions pressed heavily on him, but he knew sitting around wouldn't fix anything. If he wanted a second chance, he'd have to earn it. Determined to make amends, Marcus started volunteering at a local community center. At first, the staff eyed him suspiciously, unsure what to make of this former millionaire-turned-helper. But as days turned into weeks, they began to see genuine effort in his actions. He helped serve meals to the homeless, tutored children struggling with math, and even cleaned up trash in nearby parks. Each act of service chipped away at the guilt he carried inside. For the first time in his life, Marcus wasn't doing something because it made him look good or brought attention. He was doing it because it felt right. Volunteering also gave him perspective. Listening to people share their struggles reminded him how sheltered his old life had been. A single mother working 2 jobs to feed her kids, a teenager trying to stay out of trouble despite growing up in a rough neighborhood, an elderly man who lost everything after falling ill. Their stories humbled him, teaching him empathy in ways his wealth never could. Slowly, Marcus began to understand the importance of compassion, a lesson he wished he had learned long before pouring paint over a royal guard. During this time, Marcus reached out to the British authorities and the affected guard, writing heartfelt letters of apology. "I can't undo what I did," he wrote, "but I hope you'll believe me when I say I'm truly sorry. I disrespected something sacred, and for that, I will always carry regret." While he doubted they would respond, the act of writing those words brought him some measure of peace. Apologizing wasn't easy, especially when forgiveness seemed unlikely, but it was a step toward healing. For them, and for himself. Marcus's journey toward redemption wasn't without challenges. Old habits sometimes crept back, and there were moments when self-doubt threatened to consume him. Some days, he questioned whether anyone would ever trust him again. But then he'd think about the faces of the people he met at the community center, the smiles of gratitude, the quiet nods of acknowledgement, and he'd remind himself why he needed to keep going. By the end of his first year post-prison, Marcus noticed subtle changes, not just in his surroundings but within himself. He no longer craved attention or validation. Instead, he found fulfillment in helping others. Conversations with counselors and mentors taught him to confront the entitlement and arrogance that had driven his actions in the past. He realized his biggest mistake hadn't been pouring paint on a guard. It had been failing to recognize the value of respect, responsibility, and humility. One evening, as he walked home from the community center, Marcus paused under a street lamp and looked up at the sky. The stars twinkled faintly through the city lights, offering the glimpse of something bigger than himself. For so long, he had lived for fleeting thrills and superficial success. Now, stripped of all that, he understood what truly mattered: connection, purpose, and the courage to grow from your mistakes. Redemption wasn't a destination, it was a process. And though the road ahead remained uncertain, Marcus finally felt ready to face it. Marcus's life after prison was far from perfect, but it had purpose. He spent his days volunteering at the community center and his nights reflecting on how much he'd grown since that fateful day in London. The world hadn't forgiven him overnight. In fact, many people still associated him with the infamous paint incident. But Marcus no longer cared about public opinion. What mattered to him now was proving, even if only to himself, that he could be better. One afternoon, as he helped organize a food drive for struggling families, an idea struck him. Why not share his story? Not to glorify his past mistakes, but to warn others about the dangers of arrogance and recklessness. If his downfall could teach someone else the importance of humility and respect, then maybe his suffering wouldn't have been in vain. That night, Marcus sat down with a notebook and began writing. At first it was just fragments, memories of standing outside Buckingham Palace, the sting of judgment in the courtroom, the cold walls of his jail cell. But soon, those fragments turned into chapters. Writing became therapy for Marcus. It forced him to confront every painful detail of his journey, from the moment he poured paint on the guard to the isolation he endured behind bars. He wrote honestly about his flaws, the entitlement, the need for attention, the disregard for consequences. But he also documented his transformation, the lessons learned in prison, the friendships formed at the community center, and the slow process of rebuilding trust with his family. By the time he finished his memoir, titled Painted Lessons, Marcus felt lighter, as though he had finally exorcised the ghosts of his past. The book was published quietly, without fanfare or flashy marketing campaigns. Marcus didn't want it to feel like another attempt to grab attention. Instead, he focused on speaking engagements at schools, libraries, and community events. Standing before crowds, he shared his story with raw honesty, holding nothing back. "I thought I was untouchable," he often said, his voice steady but filled with regret. "But I learned the hard way that actions have consequences, not just legally, but emotionally and socially." To his surprise, audiences responded deeply. Teenagers confessed they admired his courage to admit fault. Parents thanked him for giving them a real-life example of accountability to discuss with their kids. Even former critics who once condemned him online reached out to say his story inspired them to reflect on their own behavior. For Marcus, these moments were worth more than any amount of money or fame he'd chased in his old life. His relationship with his family also began to heal. Claire, his ex-wife, reluctantly agreed to meet for coffee one Saturday morning. They talked for hours, cautiously reconnecting after years of bitterness. Though reconciliation wasn't immediate, they found common ground in co-parenting Emily, who slowly warmed up to her father again. During weekend visits, Marcus bonded with his daughter over simple activities, cooking dinner together, playing board games, or taking long walks. Each smile she gave him felt like a small victory, proof that love could endure even the worst mistakes. Meanwhile, Marcus continued working tirelessly at the community center, earning the respect of colleagues and volunteers alike. His dedication caught the eye of a local nonprofit, which offered him a position as an outreach coordinator. It wasn't glamorous work, but it fulfilled him in ways his previous career never had. Helping others rebuild their lives reminded him daily of his own second chance. By the time Painted Lessons became a bestseller, Marcus had already moved on from seeking validation. The success of the book wasn't about fame. It was about impact. Readers around the world wrote to him, sharing how his story resonated with their struggles. Some admitted they too had made reckless decisions. Others thanked him for reminding them to treat traditions and people with respect. Through his words, Marcus discovered a new kind of legacy, one built not on wealth or status, but on growth and redemption. Looking back, Marcus knew he could never erase what he'd done. The image of the painted guard would always linger, a permanent mark on both his life and history. But instead of letting it define him, he chose to let it transform him. Piece by piece, he rebuilt not just his reputation, but his humanity. And in doing so, he proved that even the biggest mistakes can lead to meaningful change, if you're willing to face them head-on. Years passed, and Marcus Langley became a different man, not just in the eyes of others, but within himself. The reckless tourist who once poured paint on a royal guard was now remembered as someone who rose from disgrace to make amends. His memoir, Painted Lessons, continued to inspire readers worldwide, becoming required reading in schools and discussion groups. People admired not just his honesty about his failures, but his determination to turn them into something positive. Marcus often said during interviews, "That single moment at Buckingham Palace defined my life, not because of what I did wrong, but because of how I chose to grow from it." His public speaking engagements took him to cities across the globe, where he spoke candidly about accountability, humility, and the importance of respecting traditions. Audiences listened intently, hanging on to every word. Some came seeking advice for their own struggles. Others simply wanted to hear the story behind the headlines. Marcus never shied away from discussing the darkest parts of his journey: the jail cell, the broken relationships, the overwhelming shame. He believed that owning your mistakes was the first step toward healing. At home, Marcus's efforts to rebuild his family paid off. Emily, now grown, had forgiven her father and even invited him to walk her down the aisle at her wedding. As they stood together under the archway of flowers, Marcus felt an indescribable sense of gratitude. Claire, too, softened over time, eventually agreeing to join him for holidays and special occasions. Though they never remarried, their friendship grew stronger, rooted in mutual respect and shared memories. For Marcus, these moments were proof that love could endure even the deepest wounds, if nurtured with patience and effort. Professionally, Marcus thrived in his role as an outreach coordinator for the nonprofit. His work connected him with people from all walks of life, those struggling with addiction, homelessness, or past mistakes much like his own. He approached each person with empathy, knowing firsthand how isolating failure could feel. Many credited him with helping them find hope when they thought there was none left. To Marcus, this was the greatest reward: seeing lives transformed, one small act of kindness at a time. As he entered his 60s, Marcus slowed down, trading international tours for quiet evenings at home. He spent his days gardening, reading, and mentoring young adults navigating difficult paths. His backyard became a sanctuary filled with vibrant flowers and lush greenery, a stark contrast to the sterile prison cell he once called home. On sunny afternoons, he would sit outside with a cup of tea, reflecting on how far he'd come. When Marcus passed away at the age of 65, tributes poured in from around the world. News outlets ran stories celebrating his transformation, calling him a symbol of redemption. Former critics praised him for using his lowest point to uplift others. Even Buckingham Palace released a brief statement acknowledging his sincere apologies and contributions to society. Though his name would always be tied to the infamous paint incident, Marcus's legacy transcended it. He proved that no mistake is too big to overcome if met with genuine remorse and relentless effort. In the end, he wasn't remembered as the man who disrespected tradition, but as someone who learned to honor it, both in others and within himself. And perhaps that was the most powerful lesson of all. Redemption isn't about erasing the past. It's about building a future worthy of forgiveness.